Today, we're going to be talking about the balancing act of managing unwanted pests, such as insects and plants and diseases, and at the same time promoting pollinators. Our insect pollinators and their pollination services are central to the well being of the agricultural and natural ecosystems that sustain us. But we'd be amiss if we also didn't mention other beneficial insects like predators and parasites and decomposers. Insect predators and parasites are natural enemies, also providing pest suppression. And decomposers help with nutrient cycling and building our healthy soils so our plants can uptake nutrients. In addition, insects are a really critical food source for the entire food web. Not only are these ecosystem services a benefit provided to us humans, but the entire ecosystem needs insects doing these jobs to stay in balance. And perhaps even tip the scale. I kind of would like us to sort of tip the scale in favor of all the beneficial insects. But we'll definitely be highlighting pollinators today and this week in honor of National Pollinator Week. So, where do we fit into this delicate balance of an ecosystem? In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer emphasizes our interconnectedness with the natural world. She says we are woven into a delicate web of relationships and our actions have consequences. This highlights the delicate web of relationships that exist between all living beings. Our choices, the products we buy, and our gardening practices have the power to either harmonize or disrupt these connections. And it can be a little overwhelming to think about a really big ecosystem and the larger environment as a whole. So instead, I want you to consider the spaces where you live. Your neighborhood is not only made up of the people that live there, but all the other non-human residents and participants in the ecosystem. So let's view our yards, our gardens, containers, raised beds, community gardens as ecosystems themselves, which in turn are part of the larger functioning network of a healthy, balanced, and sustainable environment. With this view, we all have a responsibility in pollinator protection and conservation. It's not just up to the agricultural producers or conservation managers of those really large tracts of land and state parks and national parks. It's really up to all of us. So when we talk about pollinators, there's been a wide range of factors that have been associated with pollinator declines, as has been outlined in the Wisconsin Pollinator Protection Plan. These include habitat loss, chemical exposure, and even extreme weather events. And understandably, you may not be able to counter all the factors that threaten pollinators and beneficial insects, but you can certainly minimize potential negative impacts from your own practices. Most importantly, residential areas can provide really important food and shelter for many of our threatened or endangered pollinators and other species. So if you live in an urban or suburban environment, your area can still provide a lot of great resources for pollinators and make a huge difference. So I'm going to give you two big goals here for helping pollinators. And that really is to improve the quality and quantity of habitat and to reduce stressors. And these goals are interconnected. Today, we're not really talking about how we're going to garden and plant for pollinators and pollinator-friendly plants and things like that. But we are going to talk about how you can reduce stress to pollinators, which in turn helps improve habitat. So I do want to encourage you to keep improving habitat by planting as many flowering plants as you can and providing safe nesting areas if you can in your neighborhoods and in the spaces that you garden. Our Extension Horticulture Pollinators resource page has a lot of resources to help you with this, especially about how to add more pollinator habitat to those outdoor growing spaces. And we have that linked in the chat. Chemical exposure, which was kind of highlighted on the slide before, is just one factor that has been associated with not only pollinator declines, but insect declines around the globe. So we're going to take a little closer look at chemical pesticides. First of all, what is a pesticide? A pesticide is any substance or mixture of substances that is intended to prevent, destroy, repel, mitigate any pest. And a pest could be an insect. It could be a plant that you don't want growing in a certain space. It could be a rodent. It could be a mite. It could be a fungus or a disease. All of these are pests and grouped under pesticides. And pesticide products are going to have labels on them. You're legally required to follow that label, the entire label. It's going to include what pest and plant it can be applied to, at what concentration, how to mix it, how to store it, how to dispose of it, what safety gear you need to wear, and we'll get more into that label later. Not all pesticides are the same. So we have contact pesticides, which are one type of pesticides. They control pests when they come in direct contact with a pest. For example, a plant, maybe what you consider a weed, is killed when that surface area of the plant is covered with a contact herbicide. Insects are controlled when that insecticide is sprayed directly on them, or when the insect travels across or eats a leaf that's been treated with insecticide. Contact pesticides can sit on the leaf or are sprayed on the insect itself, and they don't move or travel into the plant, so that toxicity of wherever that pesticide was touching just lasts a few days usually. On the other hand, we have systemic pesticides. These are absorbed and transported throughout a plant or an animal, and that makes them effective against pests that feed on or are in that plant or animal. So they can move from the leaves or the soil into other plant parts, such as flower and nectar and pollen. Flowers that open after systemic insecticides are sprayed can also absorb the insecticide, and the residue in the leaves and flowers can last many months, just depending on what the ingredient is in that product. There is a class of insecticides called neonicotinoids, or neonics for short. These are a class of synthetic neurotoxic insecticides that are used on crops, lawns, gardens, golf courses. They're in flea and tick pet treatments. They were developed in the mid-1990s, and neonics are probably now the single most popular insecticide class in the United States. The way they work is they bind to the nerve cells of insects and overstimulate them and destroy them. They're widely used as a systemic insecticide. The problem with them is that they kill indiscriminately. So they exterminate not only the pest insect, but also pollinators, beneficial insects, aquatic invertebrates. And because they are systemic, they're absorbed into the plant. And these neonics can be present in the pollen and nectar, which could make them toxic to pollinators that are feeding on those flowers. There's a potentially long-lasting presence of neonics in plants. That makes it possible to harm pollinators even when the initial application is made months before those flowers bloomed. And once in the soil, neonics can remain active for years, and rain or irrigation water can easily carry them long distance to contaminate new soil, plant life, and water supplies. So as a systemic, they are applied in a lot of different ways. They might be a seed treatment. They could be a spray on the leaves called a foliar spray. There's drenches that you put into the soil or around the trunk. There could be injections that's called a trunk injection that maybe an arborist is using. So whichever way it's applied, the pesticide is absorbed into the plant as it grows, and then as that insect maybe feeds on the leaves or something like that, that's how the pest takes in that chemical. And a Xerxes report did indicate that home garden products are containing neonics can actually legally be applied in far greater concentrations in gardens than can be in agricultural uses. So there's a really big risk to pollinators in our home garden settings. I'm going to put some chemicals or some active ingredients on the screen. These are all within the class of neonicotinoids. I will do my best to pronounce each of them. The first one is imidacloprid. Next, we have dinotefuran, we have thiamphoxam, clothianidin, acetamiprid, and thiacloprid. And if I butchered those names, probably because those chemicals are hard to pronounce, but these are all active ingredients that are within the systemic class of insecticides called neonicotinoids. So something to be watching out for if you are choosing some chemicals, which we'll get into later too. Okay, so both contact and systemic pesticides can have direct or maybe indirect harmful effects on pollinators and other non-target organisms. Now, I know that you care about pollinators. That's why you're here, right? And I know you're not intentionally trying to harm pollinators or beneficial insects. So just some questions to think about when we're looking at pesticides. What effect does a pesticide have or might have on a non-target organism? And quite frankly, we don't have enough research into all the different chemicals and all the different interactions and the long-term effects in the environment. But we do know that insecticides kill insects. That's the job. That's their job of an insecticide. They're just not going to kill one type of insect usually. They're not just labeled for one specific insect. They could cause harm to lots of different insects, even if you're not trying to spray them and kill the bees and the butterflies in your yards. So other insects, other things that might come in contact with it is called a non-target organism. So maybe the pollinators or the other beneficial organisms that I mentioned at the beginning. According to the EPA estimates from 2012, so that's a little out of date, 82 million households in the US are using insecticides. Fungicides are another type of pesticide. They kill fungus or some plant diseases. And again, they don't directly harm pollinators in the way that an insecticide would, because they're not directly killing insects. But there has been research that's been showing that the fungicides are harming the yeast and the microorganisms that the bees are collecting in the pollen. And that has a big impact either on their bee gut system or in what they are putting into those larva cells when they're packing that pollen into their brood cells. That has a big impact on the larval development if those things are contaminated with chemicals. Herbicides, those control unwanted plants. So an herbicide is essentially what you would call a weed killer. It's killing a plant that you don't want in a certain spot. And again, they might not directly kill our pollinator friends, but the ingredients can contaminate the pollen and nectar sources or the leaves themselves. And research has also shown that there are other ingredients in herbicides that can cause mortality in insects, in addition to the active ingredients. So it's definitely possible. Another question that we ask here is, where do pesticides go after you spray them? They can go onto other plants, maybe the insects or animals that eat the plants, maybe the animals that eat the insects. Some can bind to soil and be tracked into your home. They can bind to dust particles and drift for miles in the air. They can go onto the people that are applying the pesticides, so onto you, or maybe if you have a hired service. Pesticides can get into the water through runoff or infiltration. And it's really tough because, like I said, we don't have a lot of research that says all of these interactions, and it can take 10 to 20 years to see the effects. And in the meantime, we have more than 600 registered ingredients and 25,000 different products on the market. So it's hard to know what types of effects these might all have. Pollinators have really complex behaviors. And the complexity with which different chemicals are applied, it's difficult to predict pollinator exposure to a particular chemical. So we're going to look at this completely made up representation of a yard, just to examine a little closer at maybe how pollinators can be exposed to pesticides. Again, I know you're not intentionally trying to harm the pollinators and other insects in your yard, but there's lots of ways that they can be exposed to products that you might be using. Any similarity to a real yard in this graphic is just completely coincidental and unintentional. So again, these pathways of exposure could be from pesticides you are applying, maybe ones that you have a hired service using, or they travel from somewhere else. So one way that pollinators get exposed is just direct contact. The insect gets sprayed with the product, even if it wasn't intended for them, just maybe wrong place, wrong time. Residue contact. That's just, they come in contact with the product after a pesticide application. So when they visit the flowers, walk on treated leaves, or gather contaminated pollen and nectar. This is especially problematic when those pesticides have long persistence. Another pathway of interaction or exposure might be coming in contact because it's a systemic insecticide, which I mentioned earlier. Pollen and nectar can be contaminated internally by systemic products. And some of these can be very persistent, staying in plant tissues and soil for many months or longer. And we don't know if the concentration builds up in an animal after chronic exposure. So let's say that insect is visiting that leaf or landing on a leaf multiple times, and they're picking up some exposure every time they land. We don't know if that builds up chronically. Another kind of pathway or a way to get exposed is contaminated water. That could be from overspray, from drift, from runoff, pesticides adhering to dust. So interestingly, honeybees and our native bees and beneficial wasps purposely collect water. Butterflies and other pollinators use damp soil or they use puddles to drink, and all animals need water. So, and they also use that soil and those mudding puddles to consume minerals too. So pesticides can get into that water and contaminate it. Leaves or soil could be contaminated with pesticide residues. So for example, leaf cutting bees cut pieces of a leaf for their nesting materials. Mason bees separate their brood cells with mud, so they're bringing in soil into their brood cells. So those nesting materials could be contaminated as well. And wind and dust can carry pesticides for miles. So the pesticide itself can adhere to dust particles, especially at certain temperatures when it's really warm out. But we also have pesticides that might be in seed coatings that are released during planting. And those residues can be carried in the wind and land on adjacent flowers or other plants. Another way that we interact or that pollinators can interact with pesticides is through the certain formulation of pesticides. So some pesticides are like a dust or a wettable powder or a micro encapsulated formulation. So these pose a unique risk because they're sort of pollen-like. They're really small and they can adhere to the hairs on the bees and other pollinators. And they also typically remain toxic longer than liquid formulations. And another kind of spot where we can have some exposure is contaminated nesting areas. So when pesticides are applied or they drift into areas, especially of bare ground, they can contaminate nesting sites for our ground nesting bees, which are the majority of our bees nest in bare soil or in the ground. Or into shrubby habitat. So if you think of maybe a woody shrubby habitat, pesticide drift can come into that where our wood nesting and our cavity nesting bees would be. So there's lots of different pathways. I went through kind of the main ones here. There could be others that are not pictured here, but just lots of opportunities for our pollinators to be interacting with pesticides in this sort of home landscape environment. And I'm going to just address the question that came in right away. Please indicate common brands of what I'm talking about. What should we stay away from? I'm going to encourage you to, it's more about the ingredients and we're going to talk a lot about labels later on. And it's really important to know what the ingredients are. So brands are one thing, but really when we talk about pesticides, we need to know what the ingredients are. So I don't have a list of what brands to stay away from because it just depends on the ingredients. All right, so I know that pest problems happen, but we also have this responsibility, and I call it that on purpose. We have a responsibility to minimize stressors to pollinators and other insects in our outdoor garden spaces. And again, pest problems happen. You might have something munching on your leaves, or you see some discoloration on your leaves. Chemical pesticides are really not the most effective long-term tool to protect our plants for problems. So what we're going to work through next is a science-based decision-making process and strategy that you can use. It's simple. I've broken it into 4 steps. So we're going to use that to prevent and respond to garden pests while prioritizing our pollinator and insect health. So what I want you to encourage, or what I want to encourage here, is this really kind of holistic view of your garden space and your landscape. You're not in isolation. You are part of that neighborhood that I talked about at the beginning of not only the human residents, but the non-human residents, and which is part of a larger ecosystem. So again, this strategy, 4 steps here: prevention, observation, identification, and decision. Let's go through each of those. So prevention. I can't stress this enough, that healthy plants are less susceptible to pest problems. So often the problems that we get questions about is because the plant was planted poorly, wasn't planted correctly, it's not being taken care of. Maybe it shouldn't have even been planted in the spot it was planted. It's not for that zone or that type of soil or sun exposure. So again, if we're selecting and planting and caring for plants that are suited to your site, and you're using some good practices to take care of them, they're going to be able to tolerate a little bit of damage, maybe from insects if there's anything chewing on them, and they're going to be able to fight off a lot of problems. So really, before you plant anything, do your research to install plants that are going to do the best in your site conditions you have available. It is way easier to plant something that will do well in that site instead of constantly trying to amend the soil or constantly trying to prune it back because it's getting too big. Do your research ahead of time. This also might mean that you replace unhealthy plants. Maybe you have something growing and just does not do well. Take it out. Let's get something in there that will grow well in that site that you have available. And best care practices include watering properly, avoiding overmulching, providing adequate airflow around plants. So a lot of these cultural practices can do a lot to help maintain and prevent a lot of problems. When you start noticing a problem, be observant. This is called scouting. Look for those holes and spots and discoloration and other signs or symptoms. If you find holes on your leaves, like something maybe has been munching on them, look for what's causing it. And this includes looking under the leaves, maybe coming out at night and looking at with a flashlight. Lately, I've been getting a lot of earwig and slug damage on plants because they're really active, especially with our really wet spring. So we need to be observant. Okay, I know the first reaction is, ooh, I see some holes or I see something on my plants, I want to spray it. And I want to try to get a little bit more patient and be a little bit more observant before we're reaching for a spray. And being observant, we can address those underlying causes of the problem. Again, if it wasn't planted properly, maybe it's getting too much water, maybe not enough. Maybe the plants are too close together and it's too crowded. And it was just planted wrong. So again, plants can tolerate quite a bit, especially if they're healthy. And honestly, so should we. Many diseases are cosmetic and can be prevented or at least managed by proper planting and maintenance practices. And remember, we're trying to create habitat for pollinators. So the larval form, especially of our butterflies and moths, those are caterpillars and they need food too. They need the juicy leaves to feed on. A plant that has fed nothing has not done its job. I refer to that a lot by Doug Tallamy from his book, Bringing Nature Home. So insects chewing on your plants is not necessarily a bad thing. We can change our tolerance of how things we think are supposed to look too. Some holes in the leaves are probably okay and maybe nothing to panic about. All right, so let's say you noticed a problem, maybe holes in the leaves, or you've seen the culprit doing it. You went out there with a flashlight at night and found that earwig or whatever the case may be. Maybe your plant just isn't looking like it's thriving and you're noticing some discoloration on the leaves, maybe some dieback. Maybe, you have a maple that's turning color really early. Lots of different examples, lots of different signs and symptoms that you're looking for. It's really imperative. This is the other thing I'm going to stress a lot. It is critical that we identify what's happening. Identify the potential culprit, the potential problem. If it's a disease, we need to know what it is because only then do you know what your options are and what to do about it. And we have a lot of great resources to help you try to identify what the problem is. You can submit questions using the Ask Your Guardian question form for Extension Horticulture. It's a great spot to anybody in the state can submit their question with pictures. We're always going to ask for pictures and to be able to see what you're seeing. And you'll either, we can get your question answered that way and customize it to what is happening in your yard. But we also have diagnostic labs that we commonly refer to and consult with. I talk to these labs pretty much every day about questions. So there's the Wren's Weed Science Lab, there's the Insect Diagnostic Lab, we have a Plant Disease Diagnostic Lab, and a Turfgrass Diagnostic Lab. And these are really important because sometimes we do need to do some testing to confirm or even deny the presence of a disease, especially, or the insect, or maybe what's happening in your turf grass, or what kind of weed it is. Okay, so again, there's lots of tools available to correctly identify and diagnose what is causing the problem, if there is a problem. Only then can we start making some informed decisions, and learning what our options are. First, learning our options so that you can make an informed decision, so that you can do what's best for your situation. What might be good for your yard, or that plant might be a little different than what I'm dealing with. So these really should be customized to fit your situation, your yard, and your needs. And again, think holistically about your landscape. These are not in isolation. These problems and these pollinators and your plants are not in isolation from one another. There's a really holistic approach to view your yard as an ecosystem, and many tools available to help. And one option might, quite honestly, might be just to let it be. Maybe it's not really anything to worry about. Maybe the problem is sort of cosmetic, and maybe, yeah, the leaves look a little, spotty, or a little bit of leaf drop, but maybe it's just nothing to worry about. Or maybe there is some damage that we need to figure something out about. Healthy plants can tolerate quite a bit, and stressed plants are going to be more susceptible to problems. So again, we kind of need to know, we have to know what's going on in order to be able to assess a course of action. Another option might be non-chemical options to manually remove that offensive weed or the insects, or the diseased parts of a plant by using, hand tools and pruning them out. Hand picking Japanese beetles off your plants is the #1 best way to get them off your plants. So there's a lot of non-chemical options to consider first. And when we start looking at treatment options too, timing is important. The life cycle of the pest matters. So for example, removing weeds before they go to seed, or when they're really young, to make removal easier. A couple more examples here. Mulching can be a really effective way to control weeds and retain soil moisture, but just avoid really heavy mulch. You don't need to pile that mulch up, 8 inches thick. That can block access to the ground. So it's okay if there's some bare spots in your mulch. It's okay if there's some bare spots in your lawn. Leave some space around your plant so that not every inch is covered. And don't use those dyed or synthetic mulches. And if you are preparing a new site for some sort of planting, take the time to properly prepare it so that your plants can have the best success. And this might mean starting even a year in advance for that spot, depending on what you're doing and that spot itself. But take the time to properly prepare. This is something I've been personally really working on, and trying to have some more patience and taking the time to get the weeds and prep that site and get it ready, so that when I do plant, those plants have the best chance for success. Otherwise, it ends up being a waste of money, or we need to do a lot more management on the other side. All right, so sometimes we do come to a decision where a pest problem is severe enough to warrant chemical use. However, and unfortunately, many people and services are applying products like insecticides in gardens and lawns preventatively. So you just are like, just in case, I'm going to spray this. I don't want anything eating my plants. Well, the pest might not even be present. It might not be identified. Therefore, you're using the wrong thing for the wrong job, maybe. It might not even warrant treatment. So using and spraying things as just in case or as a preventative is really unnecessary and unhelpful. Remember, if you have a wide variety of insects in your yard, that's a good thing. We want that. There might only be a few that could actually cause a problem. Ideally, chemical use should be significantly reduced or completely eliminated if we are truly prioritizing the health of our pollinators and beneficial insects. Bottom line, if we really want to help the pollinators, we need to eliminate or really minimally use any sort of pesticides in our yards. But that being said, you might have a situation where you have diagnosed the pest, you've tried non-chemical options and have determined that something is warranted, where you need some chemical intervention. So here's where I'm going to encourage you to do your research. There are lots of options usually, and we can choose the most targeted, reduced risk product available. So again, remember I talked about some of those dust formulations are more risky to pollinators. So maybe we can choose a formulation that's a liquid or a less risky one. Avoid multi-use products. So a lot of these products combine insecticide with a fertilizer in them. Not a fan of those. So avoid multi-use products that are all combination ones. If you need to fertilize, that's a separate thing than applying some sort of pesticide. If you are hiring services to do things in your yard, learn about their practices. What are they applying? Why? Is there a problem that's been identified? Discuss what those options are before any products are applied. And then those products can be applied in a safe way if you do need to apply something. And again, we're kind of thinking about this holistically. So even if chemicals are warranted, they're still going to be used in combination with other methods. So other non-chemical methods, again, we're going to try to have good care practices so that we're preventing problems in the future as well. We talked a lot about the different pathways that pollinators can be exposed directly or indirectly. So in a minute, we're going to be talking more about the product label, but one thing the label isn't going to necessarily tell you is how to apply it to keep pollinators safe. So if you do need to apply pesticides, keep them away from areas where pollinators are likely to visit and feed. And again, pesticides is the big group name. So we're talking about insecticides or fungicides or herbicides. So if we can keep them away from areas where pollinators are likely to visit and feed. So some ways to do that, to use them a little bit more safely when we're thinking about pollinators. Avoid using insecticides in lawns where you have flowering plants, and I know a lot of times we call those weeds. Rarely, honestly, rarely does a Wisconsin lawn need an insecticide. But if you do need to apply something, mow that turf so that you're mowing those flowers off before spraying any insecticide, so that you're reducing the risk to pollinators. Next, if you are using something, make targeted applications. So spot treatments directly to the pest or the plant instead of broadcasting it over everything. Check the weather. Don't spray when it's raining and when rain is expected in the next 24 hours. And don't spray on a hot, windy day. Those ingredients in those pesticides can volatilize at certain temperatures and get into and bind to dust particles and then drift and drift and drift. Choose the least hazardous formulation. We talked about that. Pesticide dusts are the most hazardous as they can stick to the hairs on an insect. Granular formulations are going to be the least hazardous when we're applying in an area where bees are present. If you can, apply as late in the day or in the evening if possible, when pollinators are less active. And don't spray on blooming flowers because, pollinators could land on there. All right. Labels. When you are looking at products, take the time to read the entire label. Again, you are legally required to follow that label, including what pest and plant the product can be applied to, at what concentration, how to mix it, how to store it, how to dispose of it, what safety gear you need to wear. So we're going to look at a label. We're going to look at this example of 7 insect killer and go through the different parts of the label. So on a label, you have the brand or trade name. And this is just something to be aware of, that products with the same active ingredient could have different trade names or different brands, depending on the manufacturer. And also, there could be different active ingredients, but have the same brand. So again, I usually refer to what the active ingredients are when we're looking up information and talking about how to use these things. So the brand or a trade name just indicates the name, but it's not the active ingredient in there. And the brand could have different products that have different active ingredients that can be used differently. There should be a EPA registration number. This tells you that the EPA has reviewed the product and determined that it can be used with minimal or low risk if you follow the directions on the label properly. And when they're talking about minimal or low risk, that is to you, yourself, and your health. So not necessarily environmental risk, but the risk to yourself as long as you follow the label. The ingredients are going to be listed. So there are active ingredients and there are other ingredients called inert ingredients. The active ingredient is the chemical registered by the EPA, and that's the one that's causing the toxicity of the product to the organism. So the toxicity of that chemical, that active ingredient, is described as the amount of the chemical required to kill an organism. And how this is measured is in the lab, where the amount of that ingredient is likely to kill half of the organisms that encounter it in a laboratory setting. So this is called LD50, and it's based on really short-term 4-day tests. So that is the amount of that ingredient likely to kill half of the organisms in a lab setting. So chronic and long-term exposure is not measured in these tests. There are also other ingredients in these products that could potentially be toxic. These could be penetrating agents or odor maskers and stabilizers or preservatives, surfactants that help get the chemical into the plant, emulsifiers, propellants, solvents, spreaders, stickers, anti-foaming agents, dyes, and others. So there are other ingredients in there that could potentially be toxic. Again, we need more research on all of these things to see how they all interact with our pollinators. So a signal word is going to be on there. That's your caution or warning or danger to indicate the acute toxicity of the product to you as a human. And, based on one or more potential routes of exposure, meaning it gets into your eyes or it gets into your mouth or it gets onto your skin. So the keep out of reach of children also appears with the signal word on the label of all pesticides. A caution signal word is the least harmful to you, while a warning is going to be more toxic to you than those with a caution label. If you see something that's danger, that's the most poisonous or irritating and really should be used with extreme care because that can cause severe burn to you, your skin, your eyes. Most pesticides with a danger signal are pretty restricted, so not typically available for the general public. And also, just because a product might say organic or natural doesn't mean it's automatically safe. Doesn't mean it's safe for you necessarily or for your plants or the environment. There's still going to be a signal word. There's still going to be a label. There's still going to be some toxicity there. So you need to continue reading the label and make sure the product is intended for what you're using it for. So don't count on just because it says organic or natural that it's necessarily a safe product. So that's just the front of the label. It doesn't stop there. We're going to flip it over. On the back, there's precautionary statements. So this part tells you what you need to wear, maybe gloves or goggles, and what kind of safety gear you need, or also the hazard to domestic animals. Maybe you need to keep your pet off that treated area for a few days, things like that. There's going to be first aid, and that label tells you what to do if somebody accidentally is poisoned by the pesticide. Again, these are first aid. In case of emergency, definitely call the emergency number, call your doctor, the poison center, go to the ER if you need to. If you do need to do that, take the product with you and administer first aid and follow that emergency. But that will give you some instructions if something, maybe you get it on your clothes or maybe something like that. The environmental hazard statement, and you'll notice I have this bee icon here too. So the environmental hazard statement is going to indicate if it's harmful to wildlife or fish, pollinators, endangered plants and animals, water bodies like ponds and lakes and rivers and wetlands. But I'll caution you here that it might not have everything on there. So while you should pay attention to the environmental hazards, it's not the end all of the harm that it might cause to the environment. If you see this bee icon box here, this is a bee advisory box. You automatically signals you that this pesticide has a potential hazard to bees. Now that's not on the 7. I just added that to show you that there is this bee icon box that did not come from this 7 insect killer. So if you do see that on some other product, it automatically know that it has some harm to pollinators. So it's a good signal, but products don't always have that. So products that don't have the B advisory box can still be harmful. So it's still really important to know how to read the rest of the label and do your research. And so we're not at the point where we can completely rely on these hazard statements. And then kind of the last part on this part of the label is storage and disposal, to read carefully and follow those directions for safe storage and disposal of pesticide products. Keep them in their original container, out of reach of children, store them away in a locked place if you can. And any disposal of pesticide containers in a manner not listed on the label can lead to contamination of the environment or harm to other people. Okay, but wait, there's more. The label does not stop there. Here's where on the back, there's usually a plastic coating, and you need to open that up, peel back the label, and start looking at the enclosed booklet. It's usually small print. It's usually about 57 pages long or more. I know it's a lot, but this is where there is a lot more additional information that you need to know and follow, especially about the target pests that you are trying to target on, how to apply it, maybe what plant you can use it on or what plant you can't use it on. So that inside booklet has more information that is really important to know how to apply it to whatever plant or pest you're trying to use it on. I've had a lot of situations where people were using the wrong product for the wrong pest, and essentially that's a waste of money and contaminating things. So we want to use the right thing for the right job. I'm going to take label reading even a step further. I know you're probably tired of it, but we're going to take it a step further. We're going to look at a different example at this Ortho Home Defense Backyard Mosquito and Bug Killer, just a random example. We're going to use this example for looking at the National Pesticide Information Center. So this is a zoom in of the active ingredients here. Bifenthrin is the active ingredient that we're going to be looking up. So I looked up this product label online. It did not have a B advisory box, but when you went into that booklet, it lists all the insects it kills. So yes, it kills mosquitoes, but it kills a lot of different insects, bees and beetles and caterpillars and crickets and moths and sow bugs and spittlebugs and wasps and many, many others. There was a huge list of insects that it did kill. So I wanted to look this up at the National Pesticide Information Center. And what that center is, it provides factual, unbiased information about pesticide products and safety practices and regulations, environmental effects, and other management information. So looking at bifenthrin, it is particularly highly toxic to bees and fish and small aquatic organisms. And it says, well, it's low toxicity to birds. But I'll remind you that most of a bird's diet is insects. They eat a lot of insects. So if we're killing off insects, what do the birds and the other animals have to eat? So again, not that we just want to do our research and be aware of what we're using and why. All over the world, pollinators and our other beneficial insects are facing stressors that are significantly and drastically reducing their populations. Wisconsin is not exempt from this. This is already having major impacts to the ecosystems they provide us, but also to the overall health of our environment. Quite frankly, we are just at a critical need to own up to our responsibilities of taking care of our neighborhoods and communities, the human and the non-human residents. Fortunately, pollinators are one of the easiest groups to support in your residential landscapes. Even small spaces, even some containers on your patio can have an effect. It can help those pollinators meet the most basic needs of their life cycle. What you apply in your garden and what you plant and how you take care of that land, the products that you purchase, all of these things are what you have direct control over, and that can make a huge difference to pollinators. So if I've left you with anything, remember to try to improve habitat as one of your goals and reduce those stressors. And when problems arrive, use that holistic approach, science-based tools to help you make really informed decisions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Julie Hill, for that wonderful presentation. Learned a lot. We do have a few questions. So the first question, there's two questions that are very similar, and I'll combine them. And they ask, do herbicides have a pesticide effect, and does Roundup kill beneficial insects? And then asking for clarification, am I understanding correctly that herbicides are considered a pesticide, Julie?
Yes. So herbicides are considered a pesticide. So pesticide is the big group that any product that is meant to harm, kill, destroy, repel, mitigate any sort of pest is called a pesticide. So that includes herbicides, which are plants. Herbicides kill plants. Insecticides kill insects. Miticides kill mites. Fungicides kill fungus. Rodenticides kill rodents. So those are all pesticides. Roundup on beneficial insects. So Roundup is a type of herbicide. The active ingredient in Roundup is usually glyphosate. And, there probably hasn't been enough research to see how much does that contaminate possible pollen and nectar sources. So there is a risk there. There's a risk that those ingredients can contaminate pollen and nectar. So again, if you're using it, just be really targeted with how you're using that. We don't need to broadcast it over everything. But if you're targeting a certain weed or something, then you can, use that in a careful way.
Perfect, perfect. So a next question is, how long do products last once the concentrate is properly diluted? And then they said they couldn't find that information on the label.
Well, so it depends on what it is. Again, contact pesticides and systemic pesticides are going to be different. Contact pesticides are not going to last as long. So I would look at the active ingredients, and we could look up at the National Pesticide Information Center for more on that information. So it depends. A lot of this depends on what it is, what the ingredients are, and how it's being used.
Okay. So it really depends. So another question is, what about fertilizers? Do NPK fertilizers such as Miracle-Gro or Osmocote harmful to pollinators at all?
Good question. I did not look into fertilizers at all. I have not seen anything that says that they're directly harmful, but I have not looked into if there's research on that. I don't know if Tim or Jacob, if you have information on any research about fertilizers. I would say with fertilizers, there might not be direct harm to contaminating pollen and nectar sources, but we also want to be careful with fertilizers that we're applying them in the right concentrations to meet the need of our soil, where I'll plug soil testing, so that we're not over applying, because a lot of times our soil already has a lot of great nutrients. We just don't want to over apply because that can cause other problems in the environment.
Perfect. So we have just a few more questions. We got a little bit more time. So one question is, how do you use neem oil, or when would you use neem oil? And does this have any toxicity towards pollinators?
So I do have some charts here that I can refer to, and I can that we can look up. So neem oil is considered low toxicity to bees. That's what they do a lot of testing on, is honeybees, to determine if something is toxic. I'll say that they haven't tested toxicity on every type of pollinator or every type of insect. Most of what we know about toxicity comes from testing it on honeybees. So neem oil itself is low toxicity or non-toxic. The active ingredient, a lot of times when you buy neem oil, there is an ingredient in there called azadirachtin. And that can have some toxicity to bees. These ingredients are insect growth regulators. So a lot of times they're used to control an insect, but they are usually considered a safer alternative. However, I will also encourage you to identify what you're trying to treat. Always identify what the problem is first, and then knowing what those options are.
So now that we're just on the topic of toxicity of certain chemicals. What about chrysanthemum-based products? They say several of their neighbors use some sprays that have this, and they're wondering if those would harm pollinators.
Good question. And you don't have a direct, I'm looking for an answer off the top of my head here, so give me a second. Tim or Jacob, if you want to jump in. I know that, some sources of chemicals are from naturally occurring sources, but that they're synthetically made, or they do come from natural sources, with the chrysanthemum is one of them. I'm looking to see the toxicity on that.
So for me, the main chemical that I know comes from chrysanthemums is pyrethrin and pyrethroids. And then in general, pyrethroids are definitely toxic to bees and pollinators.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
But I wouldn't know about any of the other synthetic insecticides. I just know that the main one is
the pyrethroid. So there's there's several ingredients that are within the pyrethroid group, including that bifenthrin, which I mentioned in my example, cyfluthrin, then propethrin, permethrin, pyrethrin. These are all highly toxic to bees. And again, these tests have been done on honeybees, so we kind of carry that over, saying, well, they're toxic to pollinators then, while the tests have been direct on honeybees. But I would say that anything with a pyrethroid has high toxicity, yes.
Especially if it's a synthetic chemical.
Exactly. So even though something, now it started off as a naturally occurring thing in chrysanthemums, right? But now we've been able to manufacture that synthetically. So I would still exercise a lot of caution. Again, why are we using it? For what purpose? Is it just something that we're trying to use preventatively, which usually doesn't help? So a lot of these ingredients can still be toxic.
So yeah, our next question is, what about mosquito spray for our bodies? So about the toxicity level, and then about maybe potential contact.
I would say that's a low risk to pollinators, since they're not foraging on you, or interacting with you as they would a plant. So if you're using, a repellent or DEET or something on your body, that's a low risk to pollinators.
Okay. Yep. And so I think mosquito spray contains DEET, which would be toxic to pollinators, but since we don't interact with them in such a manner, that it definitely would not be.
Now, I would caution against using the bug zappers in your yard and things like that, because that can attract a lot of beneficial insects into those zappers and be harming them. So,
and along those lines, there are a lot of moths that come out in the evening that are also pollinators that get trapped by those bud zappers as well, and that's obviously detrimental to those evening pollinators. There's many moths and other pollinators that are active at night, which often gets overlooked because we're not out there looking for them.
And we have a moth program coming up in July, so we're going to be able to hear more about that.
Okay, so we just have a few more questions. I have a persistent significant problem with rose slugs, sawflies on my roses. Is there a product that how can I most safely use spinosad?
Great question. I am not, I would have to look into it and talk with our entomologist about rose slugs and sawflies on roses to see what is the recommended treatment. That I would do a little bit more research into. And we can look up in the National Pesticide Information Center more about spinosad too.
Perfect. So just in general, there are timing issues. We can always apply when the pollinators are there, like Tim talked about. So just one general way of, is, looking for timing. So one of the last questions is there any...
I'll mention one other thing about roses, Jacob.
Yep.
We also have to analyze the risk with roses, what type of roses there are, because if, there are roses that are really the lots and lots of petals and very little pollen, there's going to be a low interaction with pollinators on those types of things. So some of it depends on the plant that you have. So, or the type of rose that you have, and analyzing that risk that you have. So you can certainly use the product in ways that I had mentioned, applying at night, really targeted treatments, don't spray on a hot, windy day, you know, or if it's going to rain, but also analyzing how much risk does this have, for this particular plant have with pollinators, especially with roses, because some roses, the really traditional roses that don't have a lot of, you know, all those really multi-petaled ones, pollinators are using, but some of these other cultivars and stuff, pollinators probably aren't using them so much. So it depends.
Just to expound on that, the differentiation is tea roses are the traditional roses that most people think of and aren't grown widely in gardens typically, but the hardy shrub roses, pollinators will use those and utilize those, but typically not the double flowering shrub roses, typically the single petal like Julie was mentioning. So there is a differentiation there.
And then with sawfly and slugs, most of the damage are going to be on the leaves as well. You know, they will feed on the flowers, but, you know, make sure to treat the leaves and not spray just the whole plant and the flowers, like Julie said, to really target that application to where they are and understanding of pollinators. So we keep getting a few more questions, and we still have a tiny bit more time. So 2 minutes. And so I will read this big one, so that'll probably take us out. Is there any information you can provide us on organizing and advocating for the improved usability or the customer interface for various insecticides, pesticides? And then they said the burden should be on manufacturers, corporations to make this information transparent and representative of the ecological harm. So basically, I would say, is there any, you know, what can we do to advocate for improved labels to really make identifying problem pesticides easier?
Right. Well, a couple things off the top of my head. I was not prepared for this question, so this is my off-the-cuff answer, is that there are organizations working on these things, like the Xerxes Society, that are making pleas, you know, to the bigger organizations and companies to provide better labeling, those bee icons, labels and things like that. So getting involved with maybe some of those more, I would say, policy efforts, which would be through some other kind of environmental organizations. Again, if we're really prioritizing pollinators, we're not using any sort of pesticides. We're eliminating them from our landscape. So making choices with how you spend your dollars, and as a consumer, which I know seems small and maybe insignificant, but if all of us are making those choices and saying that this is what we need, then, you know, at some point the bigger manufacturers need to listen to their consumers.
Perfect, perfect. So I think that is all of our questions. And again, thank you, Julie, for so much knowledge. Thank you to Tim for my other co-moderator, and thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.